Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. This one we're going to talk about redemption arcs in Avatar and Korra, the franchise. Specifically the reason I'm talking about this is because of some of the reaction to the end of Ruins of the Empire and some of the sort of controversy that seems to have arisen around the fact that the book goes into direction, leans absolutely into direction of redeeming Kuvira as a character, and some people really not liking this. And the reason I wanted to do this video is basically to talk about, in a way like, okay, why is it that fans out there are viewing this in that way? Why are certain characters sort of allowed, like we perfectly accept them being redeemed for their past actions, but in a way like are we not allowing Kuvira to do the same? And why is it seemingly a different situation? Is there a difference? That's the sort of stuff that I want to talk about here. So the type of characters we're going to be talking about in this video are, of course, Zuko, who is basically, one of the definitions in a way of the redemption arc of a character. But we're also going to be talking about Iroh, I suppose Varrick to a degree, you could say, undergoes a sort of redemption arc. We'll be bringing up Suyin, of course, in relation to Kuvira, but also in terms of herself, her own redemption arc. In some ways, you could say the characters, even like Korra and Aang, have redemption arcs, but of a different kind, but the same basic idea. But we'll also talk about the characters who, in a way are in similar positions in a way to Kuvira, but don't get the redemption arcs and kind of the difference and so on. So, yeah, it ultimately gets down to the idea that, look, ultimately the term redemption arc is a fairly general thing. There's a difference between saying redemption arc for Zuko and say redemption arc for Korra. Whereas with Zuko's redemption arc, it's a clear cut. He goes from being on the wrong side of the war to being on the right side of the war. He goes from basically trying desperately to support his father and the sort of Fire Nation full stop, to opposing the Fire Nation, opposing his father, and supporting Aang, who he'd previously tried to capture. Undergoing a full change in approach, attitude, and side. Whereas Korra's redemption arc from Korra, this is specifically in Book 4, is different in that it's not a change of sort of, she goes from being villain to hero, but it's just redeeming herself in the sense that, in a way, her being injured allowed what happened with Kuvira to happen, and then over the course of Book 4, her return and sort of becoming the Avatar again, stopping Kuvira, is a redemption arc of sorts as well. A very similar one to Aang and his failure, or his own perceived failure in Book 2, the loss at Ba Sing Se, and then his return at the sort of invasion, the failure there, and then finally, in a way, redeeming himself, or coming out good in the end, at Sozin's Comet. They're both ultimately redemption arcs of a sort, in that the whole idea of like Zuko and the whole regaining his honor is basically him saying, redeem myself, but his intent behind how he should redeem himself obviously changes and switches, and that's really what it's just all about. So is Kuvira allowed to have a redemption arc? Like, does Kuvira actively in Ruins of the Empire undergo a redemption arc? Yes, because fundamentally she fits all the criteria. She had done stuff in the bad that she presently wants to make amends for, and so she changes and really tries to make it clear that she has changed. She switches sides, so she actually has a probably more eventful sort of redemption arc than some of the other characters who undergo it, in that it's more similar to a Zuko in that she does undergo a complete, side switch. And then she assists throughout the entirety of Ruins of the Empire without ever really showing any signs of kind of going back to her former self. In that, at least in my reading of the book, I never at any point kind of lost faith in Kuvira's change. Anytime they teased like, oh, she's gone off on her own, I was, like Korra, aware that there was probably a reason behind it, that was related to that change rather than her kind of going back to her old ways. And so by the end of that book, when you have the characters thanking Kuvira, it's the truth, because it's not the characters being unrealistic in their reaction to Kuvira. They are honestly thanking her for being the hero of that story. Because, spoilers for Ruins of the Empire, but like, Korra doesn't really do all that much. Mako doesn't really do all that much. Bolin doesn't. Asami doesn't. Kuvira is the one who gets, you know, it done, basically. It's Kuvira and Baatar, actually, together, who kind of solve this. Yes, Korra is there to, like, assist at the end. Toph is there to assist. Sue. But it's Kuvira who makes all of the magic happen, so to speak, in that book. And if she wasn't there, maybe we could have resolved it in some other way, but the point of the story is that her involvement was essential to Asami, Mako, Bolin, and everyone else, Wu, being not brainwashed anymore. She was essential to taking down Guan and his threat to kind of Earth Kingdom democracy. And that's pretty notable, like that she does make some good moves. It's a book that I think really fits into Kuvira's general kind of arc and how you're meant to view her as a character, is that, yeah, the comparison between Kuvira and Korra is really doubled down on here. That here is Kuvira showing once again why she was the character who was able to sort of stabilize the Earth Kingdom with Korra injured. And show that similarity of both being these characters who are extremely capable of sort of, you know, altering the fate of the world in a way, to a degree. And Kuvira has now sort of shown that she's able to do it on both sides. Both for sort of bad, but also kind of now showing it for good. And it linking into sort of that idea of she can redeem herself. It's going to be an ongoing process, of course. You know, it's just one comic. But the way they have it set up is that they're letting her off a little lighter than you'd think on the punishment front, to allow her to potentially do more good than she would be just kind of rotting away in prison. Which brings up the idea of, like, I don't get, in a way, why people are so sort of upset about it, because the opposite to this is that Kuvira is just in prison. She's literally put in the cell next to or nearby Zahir, and they both effectively fulfill the same role. They are a previously defeated villain who we're never going to redeem and are just there in prison. And, okay, she's there if we need to go to her about anything, but, like, the point of the matter is that, like, it is two characters sort of being used in the exact same way. The two villains who survived their books are being used in that way. So why not do something different, especially when Kuvira is very different to Zahir? While Zahir assisted in taking down Kuvira by helping Korra, it was only because it fit his ideal. It wasn't Zahir redeeming himself in any way. It was just Korra's want at that time happened to coincide with stuff that Zahir agreed with. Zahir is not going to be a character who undergoes a similar type of arc to Kuvira in Ruins of the Empire, because you get the impression that he is so entrenched in his ideals that he's a Red Lotus member. He supports Vatu as being the sort of, you know, spirit that coincides over, you know, the balance of the world rather than Rava. That's not just going to change all of a sudden. Whereas, you know, Kuvira as the leader of her kind of own thing, you know, of course she's allowed to change and evolve. So I think that, like, there's an important point to just be made there of, like, you know, it is a story. Yes, there's some validity to kind of viewing things from a very real world perspective of, like, if a real person actually did this, of course they'd be punished much more than they would be in a story. But the point is that Avatar and Korra as a franchise have this sort of approach, atmosphere, and it is an approach of optimism. It's that characters are worth giving a second chance. If there's any sense that they can do better given a certain amount of freedom, they will be allowed that freedom to redeem themselves. And that's entrenched in the show because of the likes of Zuko, because of the likes of Iroh. And it just feels weird if we're just going to suddenly go complete, you know, it's the law, justice. She has to be punished completely for every single crime that she committed. Because if we do that, all of a sudden then don't we have to view all of the other characters in the exact same way? And that's where the hypocrisy starts to come in. So I think it is important to just, when viewing these things, always view it under the kind of view of like the series and its approach. It is optimistic in most cases towards this, which is why Zuko is allowed to, by the end of the series, be the Fire Lord and not receive punishment for his actions earlier in the series. It's why Iroh is allowed to be the sort of fill-in Fire Lord in the comics when Zuko has to do something, despite his previous actions sort of supporting the, you know, evil Fire Lord sort of regime, and so on. That, you know, it's because both of those characters proved to us they could be better, and I think in Ruins of the Empire, Kuvira did very much the same thing. So, yeah, going back to the other villains, of course, like, you have Zahir, but you also have Ozai as the sort of irredeemable villains. Ozai is that good example because everyone probably has said it at some point, is that, like, look, he's not the most interesting character in that most of his character, his traits, you actually get from his appearances in the comics. And there's only like maybe 2 or 3 scenes in the show itself that really presents him as a character outside of just him being the big bad final threat, the Fire Lord. You get so much more out of him through, you know, his appearances in, you know, The Promise and The Search especially, and then little bits in Smoke and Shadow as well, than you do anywhere else. And the idea is that they continue to double down on the fact that he is irredeemable. He's still in prison without his bending, tries to plot in stuff like The Promise to guide Zuko down a different path, as well as in, you know, The Search to try and get Zuko off the throne. And we continue with the idea of, like, Ursa goes in and she says her big speech to him that just really gets across that here are traits about Ozai that are pretty much never going to change. If they were going to change, they would have changed recently, but they haven't. And that's not going to happen. And the point is that, yeah, like, going forward, like, if the comics, like, say we get 20 more comic series, I really don't think we're going to use Ozai that much in the comics going forward. I think the most we can maybe hope for is that I think Iroh might go to speak to his brother at some point to just address the situation. The creators, I think, at some point will want to touch on that relationship, which is, like, utterly unexplored. So I think just for the sense of having these two brothers talk for the first time in canon, there's some value to that. And then maybe, depending on what path we go down with Azula, you might want to have Azula talk to Ozai one last time with a different perspective. But I think in most of these cases, I think it's very much an Ursa thing. It is that character just getting out their true feelings to Ozai of, like, how terrible he was, how he is the sort of architect of how so much happened. I don't think any of that would ultimately lead to any sort of redemption arc for Ozai. Like, I don't see any situation why you would ever want to let Ozai out to assist with something and then lower his punishment. It's just the approach that they've decided to take is that he had some decisions earlier on in his life, but he chose to basically be exactly like his father, who chose exactly to be like Sozin, and, you know, there's no coming back from that, in the same way that Zahir ultimately will always choose the Red Lotus philosophy, which is flawed, over any sense of redemption, even if maybe there's a slight hope because he did assist Korra, but it's just not his style at this point. Whereas Kuvira, as we meet her in Ruins of the Empire, is willing to change, and they left that door ever so slightly open at the end of Book 4, with that sympathetic backstory about, you know, her parents abandoning her and her actions being informed to a degree by not wanting anyone else to be abandoned like she was. Now, obviously, Ruins of the Empire gives us more context to that help us to feel, yes, you know, understand that sympathy that you have for her for what happened with her parents, but also to view that as more of a sort of negative point about Kuvira's personality before she changes as well. So I think that's the thing here, is that they do a good job, in my mind, in Ruins of the Empire at showing that growth of Kuvira, because ultimately the question then becomes, is that like, okay, Zuko did some pretty bad stuff. Like he burned down Kyoshi Island. Like he kidnapped Aang. You know, his first like appearance in the show is coming in with his like force of Fire Nation soldiers and just taking over this, you know, the remains basically of the Southern Water Tribe, including taking Gran hostage. You know, they're pretty terrible actions, and like the amount of times he tries to, you know, hurt members of the team and all this stuff, you know, stealing the ostrich horse here and there, his actions as the Blue Spirit in some instances, you know, he does some bad stuff, of course, but we allow him to sort of, you know, grow beyond that because of the approach that the series takes to, you know, characterizing him. We see immediately that he's conflicted. We see that he's not the worst of the Fire Nation. That is like the role that Zhao plays, to show you that, oh, Zuko is our like first Fire Nation villain. But then almost immediately we're introduced to Zhao, who's much worse than Zuko, and you see that Zuko himself has these issues with the Fire Nation. But, you know, it's this struggle about, you know, he's continuing to do all these bad things in the aim to sort of outdo Zhao, to impress his father, to get his honor back, and it's only because of the, you know, struggles along the way that you see him gradually begin to see the effects that the Fire Nation has had on the world, begin to change, really take Iroh's advice to heart. And so when he has his big, you know, turn basically in like the Earth King, where it seems like he's finally going to make the right decision, but then when the time comes in 220, he completely like betrays everyone. It's a devastating moment. It's this huge betrayal that leads to the loss of Ba Sing Se after so long, effectively. The betrayal of Iroh. Like, Zuko really does make some bad choices that lead to some pretty terrible effects, in that, like, you look at moments like, you know, why is Katara so annoyed at Zuko? Why is she the last to forgive Zuko? Well, it's because she was this close to giving Zuko that spirit water, and if she had, and Zuko still betrayed everyone, Aang would be dead. Like, he wouldn't have been able to have been revived there. So there's those moments of just like, he came this close to sort of being almost like irredeemable in terms of some of his actions, in terms of the effects that they caused. But it's because they constantly show you that hope that they have, and that's the significance of those early Book 3 episodes for Zuko, is to highlight his own issues with the Fire Nation, of like, immediately you can see that, like, oh, Azula has sort of manipulated him in some of this, in the way she's kind of played things when they're back. The fact that when he finally goes into that meeting and he's beside Ozai and he's doing things in the right way, he realizes that deep down he's not himself. And that's why he turns back. He finally turns against Ozai, has the big confrontation during the Day of Black Sun, and he's on the good side for good, and he finally makes the right decision. That's great, and it works, and we're perfectly fine with it. When it happens, we're not constantly thinking about, oh, but you burned down Kyoshi Island. No, you're not allowed to do this. You can't join the team, Zuko, because you did this thing previously. No one is saying that, because we're allowing this story to play out in the way it does. As sort of, to a degree, unrealistic as it is, because of, you know, the extent of these characters' actions. The same kind of applies to Iroh, and I think it's almost a more extreme example of, like, we view Iroh as this very, very sympathetic character. He's one of the most liked characters in the entire show. And he has this tragic backstory, you know, the loss of his son at the Siege of Ba Sing Se. But then you almost forget about the fact that, like, the Siege of Ba Sing Se is, like, the biggest military engagement in the Avatar universe as far as we're aware. 600 days. He led the siege, as far as we're aware, start to finish. Yet we view it as a almost exclusively sympathetic moment for Iroh, just because of what happened on that final day. He breaks through the walls, but it also basically leads to the death of his son. And we almost completely turn a blind eye, to the 599 days before that, where he was the military commander leading that siege against Ba Sing Se for the Fire Nation, the evil Fire Nation who started the war against the one sort of, remaining, defensive bastion in a way in the world. That's why it's so significant when Ba Sing Se eventually does fall in Book 2. It's because even a massive siege like this wasn't able to make it happen. And of course, we don't know much about the specifics of what Iroh did or did not do, but I think the idea has to be that, he probably killed some Earth Kingdom soldiers during that, in the same way that, the Earth Kingdom soldiers killed Liu Ten or whatever happened. And we never, ever as fans talk about that, really. Probably more discussed than the Siege of Ba Sing Se is the letter that, Zuko sends to, Ursa, Zuko, and Azula, where he kind of jokes about, if I don't burn it to the ground first. And it's oh, there's that slight sense that this is Iroh still loyal to the Fire Nation, just going about the family business to a degree. And in a way, we let him away with it because it was just him going about things in the family business way. But at the same time, can you not apply that to Ozai? He just basically followed what Sozin did, followed what his father Azulon did, and so on. So why do we let Iroh away with these actions that happened, earlier on in his life? Well, of course, it's because he does cool stuff later on, like interact with the Sun Warriors, learn from the dragons and is proven worthy, joins the Order of the White Lotus, is like the Grand Lotus, and all of this stuff. Because, yeah, he redeems himself. Post the death of Liu Ten, he changes his approach. And the most significant thing he does, I think, in terms of that redemption is ultimately to guide Zuko to be the character he needs to be. That's probably more significant in a way than anything almost specific in Iroh's life that he does. But the point remains that if we take the same approach that we seem to want to take in a way with Kuvira, of she committed a crime, she has to be punished for it. Why are they writing the characters to be so dismissive and light on such heavy actions? Why does that not apply to Iroh? One, well, it's a kind of vague point in the lore. We don't know the specifics of the Siege of Ba Sing Se outside of 600 days, Liu Ten died at the end, Iroh is the commander. That's basically all we know about the event. And he did break through at some point, but we don't know to the extent. Just that after Liu Ten's death, Iroh sort of had to leave the siege. The attack obviously collapsed, and the Earth Kingdom was able to come back. That's about all that we really know. And it's the same with so many of the other characters as well. We let Zuko away with the fact that he basically burned down Kyoshi Island because of his actions later on. Yet Kuvira, who in one book, and I think this is the thing as well with this that is so kind of confusing in a way for me. I get it's sort of quick because it is just one book, but at the same time, it is the one book that sort of does the redemption arc for Kuvira. We see her change. We see her perform actions during this change. That is her taking responsibility for her past actions, as well as sort of resolving some of those actions by taking out the rest of the Earth Empire. Going ahead with, she surrenders, a certain amount of the Earth Empire surrenders, and she makes sure that the rest surrenders for sure. And she makes up things with her family, improves her relationship with her former enemies and stuff like that. There's still a long way to go, but because things went so positively, like Iroh, like Zuko, it's okay to not have Kuvira be extremely punished. And even then, she still gets punished. I think this is the thing, is that, as far as we're aware, Iroh and Zuko especially, received, no punishment for their actions, really. I know Iroh gets captured at one point by Earth Kingdom soldiers, and the idea is that they think him so dangerous because of his actions during the siege, but he obviously gets away, and we root for Iroh and Zuko in that situation. Even though technically, if you look at things in the sort of way you're meant to view it, in that Iroh is this, war kind of criminal in a way, because, you know, he was on the wrong side of that battle ultimately. And so why do we have a problem with, like, Kuvira doing things in the right way but still getting a punishment? She gets more of a punishment than basically most characters who have been redeemed, in that she's under house arrest. She doesn't have that freedom, whereas, like, Iroh and Zuko, you know, do, you know, have that freedom. Zuko becomes the leader at the end. The other point here I'll bring up, I suppose, Varrick at this point, is that, like, I did find it very interesting that he was the one who they were sort of getting up for testimony at the end, to show how bad of a person Kuvira was, when in book 2 he was the one put in prison for his actions, again taking over, you know, Future Industries in the way that he did, taking it from Asami, framing Mako, his, you know, personal betrayal of Bolin and so on. And we're okay with that because in, like, book 4, you know, in book 3 and 4, sort of Varrick redeems himself, because, like, Sue in a way is the one to sort of give him that second chance in book 3, and then while he joins Kuvira, he makes a right decision that shows the true character of him, by, you know, shutting down that project despite, you know, Kuvira's threats and so on. That we let him away with that, even though he was put in jail and he had to be sort of pardoned at a very later point. And then the fact that also that, like, Zhu Li was involved in this because she was, like, Varrick's assistant the entire time, and I know you can't necessarily just, you know, put all of Varrick's crimes onto her, but the point is she's involved because of how close the two are. Yet, who is our current president of the United Republic? It's Zhu Li. Like, it's just those type of moments where, like, if we're gonna be that harsh, then, like, Zhu Li shouldn't be the president. Varrick should probably still be undergoing some sort of a punishment for what he did to everyone back in book 2. Yet, that's not the case at all. You know, from another sort of point of view, like, Mako and Bolin are, you know, both technically former Triad members, and while, as far as we're aware, they didn't do anything too bad, still, if we took that as realistically as it could be, there's a point to be made about, you know, why aren't they getting punished more for that? Yet Mako's a police officer right now, and Bolin is, you know, in a relatively good position as, like, Zhu Li's assistant to the president. Yet they're former Triad members. It's like both relatively unrealistic things when viewed from the, you know, perspective of real life, but they make sense within the body of the story because we can acknowledge how sort of exceptional all of our main characters are. So there's that point as well. So all of this is really just to go into this discussion of, like, look, if you read Ruins of the Empire and ultimately are dissatisfied with it, you think more should have been done or whatever, fair enough. And I think the fair point about this is, like, is what happens with Kuvira realistic? No, but I don't think that's the point. Because if we bring up realism, then all of Avatar and Korra makes no sense. Because it's all, you know, over the top, people with crazy abilities doing all of this stuff, and the results of those actions being unrealistic sort of political maneuverings and all this sort of stuff. That's not necessarily the point. The point is, like, trying to create this idea that the writers are at fault, it's poorly written, Kuvira should never be redeemed because she did bad stuff. That applies. If you take that to be so literal, you have to apply it to all of the other characters. And that is Zuko, Iroh, two of the favorite characters in the entire show. You apply it to Varrick, Zhu Li, to a degree, you have to, like, apply it to as well. And I don't really get it when, in the grand scheme of things, they're fairly clear-cut about it, in that, look, Kuvira did do some very bad stuff. She is this main villain who they're attempting to redeem, which is a pretty new thing. Like, that I suppose that is the point here, in that Zuko was never one of the sort of main villains in the show as such, because he was, as of episode 3, always presented as that sort of, you know, he's also a protagonist in this story as well as sort of being an antagonist. Like, Zhao ultimately is like the main sort of book 1 villain. Azula is the main like book 2 villain who also is in book 3, and then you have Ozai introduced as well. You also have sort of Long Feng in there to be the villain of the sort of Ba Sing Se arc on the, you know, corruption side of things. And for the most part, like, we don't really attempt to redeem most of these characters. Long Feng, we don't really see any hope for redemption for him. We definitely don't with Zhao, because he's just meant to represent the sort of worst of the worst in a way of like how Fire Nation military people view things in support of Ozai. Azula, of course, we have hope for. The idea is that I think most people want to see what they do next with her arc. They want to see a commitment to that arc and do it right. Treat the character well and make logical sense of the stuff that was set up from the show and what they've already done in the comics up to now. And I, of course, would ultimately lean in the idea of also more or less attempting to redeem Azula for sort of the similar reasons to Zuko, in that we're sympathetic because we understand that ultimately Ozai is sort of the architect of, you know, the problems for both Zuko and Azula. Azula almost more so because Zuko is protected by Ursa, whereas Azula had some protection by virtue of being sort of Ozai's favorite. It also meant that all of his attention was on her, and while he was never going to sort of hurt her, the way he did sort of hurt her was by the way he raised her. And that's why we see it's sort of harder for Azula to undergo this arc. There's more heavier stuff there that's going to take a harder... It's going to be a harder hill to sort of climb over for Azula to get to those points. But we want to see it. We want to see her have that heart-to-heart with her mother. We want to see her talk to Zuko in a more normal way. We want to, I think, ultimately see maybe her try and heal things with Mei and Ty Lee. That's probably one of the key dynamics we really want. We want to see how she is with Ki, if they ever got to be on good terms, like sisters. And so on. So, like, there's another character where, like, someone who's committed some very, very bad things. She technically did kill Aang. Aang was dead for like a minute or so before Katara healed him. That is an action that you can't take away from Azula committing. There's all the sympathy that we have as for the reason for why we ultimately see hope for her, and she's not just Ozai 2.0. We don't want Azula to just be captured and put in prison next to Ozai, two of the same person. We see hope for her because of that, you know, that sympathy. But she's also done some pretty terrible things in that, you know, she is that architect of, like, the person who finally did, you know, take down Ba Sing Se. So all of this video is just to present the idea of, like, it is perfectly in line with the rest of the Avatar and Korra universe that Kuvira is allowed to have a redemption arc. Because, like other characters, she's committed terrible actions, and while she's not going to be as punished as harshly for those actions as she probably would be if it was real life, she's allowed to have this second chance. Like, Su Yin got her second chance after the whole Terra Triad incident, and her basically becoming a criminal. Her being given that opportunity by being, you know, sent off to Toph's parents by Toph. It allowed her to go on that journey, which eventually led to Su forming Zhao Fu, and eventually led to Su having that approach where she always gave people a second chance. And for Kuvira, by the end of Rings of the Empire, the biggest thing that she sort of appreciates is that after her parents gave her away, the second chance Kuvira was given was by Su. And being with Su and the Beifongs, it did change her. And while the whole disagreement about what happened after Book 3 led to the Great Uniter incident, we're past that now, and those two can go back to being, you know, mother and daughter. And there's intriguing stuff and hope for the future with the approach that they take to Su and Batar's dynamic, and Su and Kuvira's dynamic, and then Kuvira and what way did I just say the characters there? Kuvira and Su's dynamic, and Kuvira and Batar's dynamic. They're two of the main ones that we, of course, want to know about. So, yeah. And I'll just finish by saying that, look, I don't have really too much of an issue with anyone being critical of Kuvira and Rise of the Empire. I think it's just more interesting that there is actually a discussion to be had about a topic like this coming out of one of the comics. That is more than you could say for any of the comics we've had recently, and it at least makes for us being able to have an interesting discussion like this about redemption arcs, what characters like should be allowed to have them, what types of redemption arcs have we had before in the franchise versus where we can go from here. Like, I suppose from another point of view, you can even view sort of Juan's arc as a sort of redemption arc of sorts. Him being a little bit of a sort of hooligan in a way at the start with, you know, the kind of chaos he almost causes on that lion turtle, and then, you know, stealing the power from the lion turtle. And then, of course, the mistake with freeing Rava and Vatu, but then redeeming himself by, you know, trying to do everything he can to fix that, and along the way bring humans and spirits together. And through his sort of devotion to this, he helps Rava to sort of be a better character, be a better, you know, person and spirit. And there's just examples of redemption arcs across the entire Avatar universe, which is why I'm relatively okay with, you know, if they take the approach of, we want to redeem this character, I'm very willing to let the show do that. And that's why I'm not going to be particularly harsh on the book for the way it writes Kuvira, because the arc was intriguing and interesting throughout. And that's what I want from the comics. Whereas I felt it would have been super boring to just have Kuvira just be in prison, and that's it. Just to be realistic, when Avatar is the best part of Avatar that's realistic. No, not really in my mind. But they're my thoughts on this topic. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.